Imagine a royal table dripping with gold, silver and crystal, a feast fit for a queen, overflowing with meats, pies, fruits and exotic sweets. You would think the food is safe, delicious and perfect, but behind the glittering silver plates the truth was horrifying. Queen Elizabeth I, the famous Virgin Queen of England, ate food that would make most people today gag in terror. Her meals were full of decay, poison and filth. Imagine eating meat that smelled bad but was served anyway. Imagine pies stuffed with ingredients already rotting inside. Imagine fish pulled from rivers so polluted that no one would dare touch them now, and sugar so refined it could slowly harm your body. This was the daily reality for Elizabeth. The food she ate was not just unhealthy, it was dangerous, deadly, and shocking. Even the cleanest-looking fruits and vegetables were washed in dirty water or covered in mud, and the servants handling the food were often carriers of sickness, in a time with no refrigerators, no proper sanitation, and no understanding of germs. Elizabeth's meals were a battlefield between luxury and death. Every bite she took was a risk. Every sip could carry disease. And yet, she survived. She lived to be 69 years old. A long life in an era of rotting meat, poisoned sugar, and filthy rivers. In this documentary, we will pull back the heavy curtains of Tudor England. We will look at the disgusting, dangerous, and sometimes shocking food habits of the Queen. From breakfast to dinner, from meat to sweets, from rivers to pies, every meal tells a story of risk, decay, and survival. Prepare yourself. The royal table you think of as elegant and clean was anything but. The food Queen Elizabeth I ate will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about royalty. To understand what Queen Elizabeth I ate, you must first understand the world she lived in. Tudor England was a kingdom of power, wealth, and fear. It was also a kingdom of decay, disease, and death. The streets of London were filthy, the rivers were polluted, and the food people ate was often dangerous long before it reached the royal table. There were no refrigerators, there were no modern kitchens, there were no doctors who understood germs. Every meal carried a risk of illness, poisoning, or even death, and yet the Queen and her court demanded luxury, no matter the danger. The royal kitchens at Whitehall and other palaces were enormous, chaotic, and terrifying in their own way. Hundreds of cooks, kitchen boys, and servants worked day and night to produce meals worthy of a queen. Fires burned constantly, smoke filled the rooms, and pots and cauldrons were reused without washing, often carrying residue of meat, fat, and blood from previous meals. Rats and mice were everywhere, climbing over food and leaving droppings behind. Flies, the size of small birds, swarmed in summer, landing on cuts of meat, bowls of cream, and jars of sugar. There was no such thing as sterilized utensils. Wooden spoons, knives, and plates were rinsed in water that might be clean one day and full of bacteria the next. Meat was the centerpiece of Elizabeth's diet. Beef, mutton, veal, venison, and game were served in enormous quantities. But meat rotted quickly in the Tudor era. Without ice boxes or refrigeration, it was hung in kitchens or cellars for days or weeks. Sometimes the smell of decay was so strong that servants gagged while preparing it, but the meat was still presented at the table, covered in sauces and spices to hide the smell. Roasted meats might look golden and delicious on the outside, but inside they could be slimy, bloody, and crawling with bacteria. Even the Queen's palate, famous for its sophistication, could not tell the difference between a fresh roast and one that was already spoiled. Fish and eels were also staples of the royal diet, especially on fasting days when meat was forbidden. But rivers in Tudor England were open, sewers. Waste from homes, tanneries and slaughterhouses flowed directly into waterways. Fish caught in these rivers were covered in mud, parasites, and invisible germs. Some of the fish served at court were preserved in brine or vinegar, but these methods only masked the rot. They did not kill disease. Eating river fish was like taking a gamble with death. And then there was sugar. At first glance it seems harmless, a sweet treat fit for a queen. But sugar in the 16th century was extremely rare, imported from distant colonies and processed with crude methods. It was often contaminated with dirt, insects and chemicals used to refine it. Overconsumption caused tooth decay, digestive problems, and in some cases poisoning. Yet, Elizabeth loved sugar. Sugared confections, candies and marzipan were eaten at every meal, coating her teeth and stomach with dangerous substances. The Queen's fruits and vegetables were no better. Fresh produce was limited, often grown in palace, gardens or imported from abroad. But fruits like apples, pears and plums were carried in dirty baskets, often bruised or half-rotted before reaching the table. Vegetables were cooked in the same water reused from boiling meat, making them a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Even washing the food in water did not make it safe. Sometimes the water itself carried disease. Table manners at Elizabeth's court also spread illness. Dishes were shared among many hands. Forks were almost unknown. People ate with their hands, knives or spoons, touching food that had been handled by dozens of servants. Salts and sauces were reused from meal to meal, carrying germs from the first course to the next. Even the act of passing a cup or plate could transmit disease, and the Queen's close circle was not immune. Despite all this, Elizabeth survived. She navigated a world of poisoned sugar, rotten meat, river filth, and disease-carrying hands. Her survival was not a testament to hygiene or luck alone. It was a testament to the strange resilience of the human body, her careful avoidance of certain foods, and perhaps her royal fortune. This is the world we must enter to understand what Elizabeth ate. A world where luxury masked danger, where the glittering table hid rot and filth, and where every bite carried risk. Only by stepping fully into this world can we see the shocking reality of the Queen's meals, and the horror behind the plates of gold and silver. For most people today, breakfast is simple: bread, cereal, fruit, maybe eggs or milk. For Queen Elizabeth I, breakfast was a dark ritual of danger disguised as luxury. Every morning the Queen sat down to a table piled high, with meats, breads, pastries and sweet treats, but none of it was truly safe. Her first meal of the day was the first gamble with death. Breakfast usually began late in the morning, after long courtly rituals. Servants brought trays with roasted meats, cold cuts of leftover game, pies, and even fish. Imagine a tray of cold beef that had been sitting in the kitchen for days, covered in a layer of dust and insects. Imagine a platter of pheasant or swan, their skin browned and crisp, while inside the meat was still slimy, half-rotted, and crawling with invisible germs. Elizabeth, proud of her refined taste, often ignored the smell or appearance, relying on sauces, spices and sugar to mask the rot. Bread was another danger. The Queen ate only white bread, imported from the finest mills or baked by palace bakers. It looked perfect, golden crust, soft inside. But flour was often contaminated with insects or mould. Kitchens were infested with rats and mice, and bread stored overnight could easily become a feast for vermin. Even the crumbs were risky. Flies, landing on meat and bread alike, carried disease from one dish to another. Porridge was sometimes served, especially for lighter mornings. Milk, when available, was fresh only for a few hours before spoiling in the heat of the kitchen. Sour milk could make the Queen violently ill, but sometimes it was added to porridge anyway, thickening it while hiding the sour taste with honey or sugar. The Queen's sweet breakfast foods were even worse. Candies, marzipan, and sugared pastries were luxurious but contaminated. Sugar, imported from colonies and handled by dozens of hands, could harbour dirt, dust, and insects. Marzipan sometimes contained almond paste stored in warm kitchens, allowing moulds and bacteria to grow. Every bite carried a hidden risk of poisoning or stomach infection. Elizabeth's love of sugar was notorious. She ate it with every meal, coating her teeth and digestive system with a substance that was as dangerous as it was sweet. Even her beverages were suspect. Tea and coffee had not yet arrived in England, so the Queen drank water, milk, and sometimes ale for breakfast. Water was a risk in itself, as it could be contaminated with human waste or runoff from slaughterhouses. Ale was safer in some ways because the fermentation killed bacteria, but even that could harbour mould if poorly stored. Sometimes the Queen drank possets, a mixture of milk, eggs, sugar, and wine, where spoiled milk or eggs could trigger severe illness. Servants played a hidden role in the danger of breakfast. They prepared, carried, and served food that was already suspect. Hands were rarely washed, knives were reused, and dishes were passed from one person to another. One careless servant could expose the Queen to countless germs. And yet, Elizabeth rarely fell ill immediately, masking the fact that every breakfast was a tiny brush with death. Perhaps the most shocking reality was how much she ate. Breakfast was not a small dainty meal. It was a feast, a showcase of wealth and power. The Queen could consume dozens of bites of meat, bread, and sweet pastries in one sitting. Each mouthful was risky, each bite a potential source of food poisoning. But to refuse food was unthinkable in the royal court. The appearance of appetite signalled strength, vitality, and authority. Showing weakness by refusing spoiled or dangerous food could ruin a royal reputation. In Tudor England, breakfast was supposed to start the day with energy and health. For Elizabeth, it was a silent battle. Every morning she dined with death at her side, a dangerous indulgence masked as royal luxury. Her stomach, her immune system, and her nerves were under constant assault. Yet she persisted. The Queen's breakfast was a mirror of the Tudor world itself, a mixture of beauty and decay, wealth and filth, power and risk. What she ate in the morning set the tone for the rest of the day. Every bite was a choice between survival and sickness, and every morning the gamble began again. For the Queen, a meal without meat was unthinkable. But in Tudor England, the meat that reached even the royal table was often far from safe. It was frequently spoiled, sometimes crawling with maggots or full of bacteria that modern science would recognise as lethal. The smell alone could knock out a modern human, but in Elizabeth's court, foul-smelling meat was masked with sauces, spices and sugar, turning rot into a dangerous delicacy. Meat was delivered to the palace either fresh or more often partially preserved. Slaughterhouses were chaotic, filthy places. Animals were killed in open yards or dark sheds, and blood ran freely across floors where rats, flies, and insects thrived. Meat was handled by dozens of people, each touching it with unwashed hands covered in sweat, blood, and filth. Sometimes meat was hung in the cold winter air to age, but during summer, temperatures quickly turned meat from aged to rotten. Roasts might sit in kitchens for days, the outside browned and inviting, while the inside became slimy, darkened, and sour. Venison, prized for its flavour and elegance, was no exception. Hunted deer were often stored in game larders for long periods. By the time they were brought to Elizabeth's table, the meat could smell strongly of ammonia, a sure sign of decay. To hide the stench, cooks smothered the meat in sauces made of wine, vinegar, and a mix of ground spices like cloves, pepper, and nutmeg. These sauces did not make the meat safe, they only masked the rot. The Queen, accustomed to strong flavours, often did not notice the hidden dangers. She would slice into a pheasant, its skin golden and crispy, only to find its flesh soft, discoloured, and full of germs. Even beef and mutton, the staples of her diet, were risky. Large cuts were hung in cold storage for days, sometimes weeks. Servants carved the meat with knives that had already been used on previous roasts. Wooden chopping boards were rarely cleaned properly. The grooves and cracks trapped juices, fat, and bacteria from older meats. Sometimes maggots, small, white wriggling larvae, infested cuts that had been sitting too long. These would often be removed quickly or hidden under sauces, and the meat would still be served. Elizabeth may not have known she was eating partially decomposed flesh, but her stomach certainly bore the risk. Pork was less common, but equally dangerous. Pigs were often slaughtered in unsanitary conditions, and pork fat spoiled rapidly. The Queen sometimes ate bacon or salted pork, but the salt only preserved the outer layers. Inside, the meat could be tainted by bacteria or parasites. Trichinosis, a parasitic disease caused by undercooked or contaminated pork, was common in Tudor England. Single slice of improperly prepared pork could cause fever, vomiting, and death. Yet to refuse meat, especially exotic or expensive meat, would be unthinkable for a monarch. Game birds such as swan, peacock, and pheasant were the most dangerous. Exotic meats were treated as symbols of wealth and status, but they were rarely fresh. Birds were hunted in the wild, sometimes days before being served. Their flesh was stored in cool pantries or smoked slightly, but without proper preservation. Bacteria multiplied quickly. Roasted swan might look like a golden masterpiece, but beneath the skin, decay was often underway. Maggots, small insects or slime, could lurk in joints and cavities. Spices like mace, saffron, or cinnamon were used to mask odours, but they did nothing to kill pathogens. Eating these birds was like playing a high-stakes game of roulette with illness. Another horrifying reality was the use of offal. Liver, heart, kidneys, and brains were considered delicacies, sometimes even the Queen's favourites. These organs spoil faster than muscle meat. They could turn black or greenish within hours, emit a sour, pungent stench, and harbour more bacteria than the prime cuts. Yet they were served with pride, sometimes fried, baked, or boiled in sauces that only partially disguised their decay. A royal palate demanded richness and variety, but every taste carried the risk of food poisoning. Even preserved meats were not safe. Hams, salted and smoked, could still harbour hidden rot. Large cuts were stored in wooden barrels with salt, sometimes for weeks. Elizabeth's chefs often tasted meat themselves before serving, but their standards were different from ours. Slight spoilage, faint odour, or slimy texture might have been considered acceptable, or even normal. The way meat was cooked could also make the danger worse. Roasting over. Open flames was common, but it did not always cook the meat evenly. Thick cuts could remain raw inside, providing the perfect environment for bacteria. Stews and pies were another method, but the long cooking times sometimes failed to destroy all pathogens. Even pies, which looked golden and inviting, were traps for rot. Meat pies could contain layers of spoiled meat beneath fresh pastry, hidden by spices, gravy, or sugar. The Queen might bite into a seemingly perfect pie, only to discover foul-smelling, unsafe meat inside. Finally, consider the sheer quantity of meat Elizabeth consumed. Her meals were enormous displays of power, dozens of dishes, multiple types of meat, served in courses that stretched for hours. Her stomach, strong from years of indulgence, tolerated rotting flesh that would sicken a commoner. Yet even she could fall ill. Records show the Queen occasionally suffered stomach pains, fevers, and digestive issues that may have been caused by spoiled meat, food. Poisoning, parasites, and bacterial infections were everyday threats, even for a monarch with the best resources in England. In short, Elizabeth's meat-heavy diet was a constant gamble. Every roast, stew, and pie was a potential source of illness. The luxury and wealth of the court could not eliminate the risks of rot, maggots, parasites, and bacteria. Yet she ate with confidence, as if the wealth and power of her crown could shield her from the dangers lurking on her plate. This was the reality of Tudor feasting: opulence hiding horror, abundance hiding decay. But there was one indulgence that defined her meals and her health in ways far more dangerous than meat or fish: sugar. To Elizabeth, sugar was not just a sweet treat. It was a symbol of power, wealth and refinement. But in 16th century England, sugar was a silent poison. Sugar in Elizabethan England was extremely rare, expensive, and imported from distant colonies. It came from sugarcane, processed in tropical climates far from England, and travelled for months over rough seas. By the time it reached the royal kitchens, sugar was often contaminated with dirt, insects, sand, and even bits of foreign material from the crude extraction process. Workers in colonial plantations had little care for cleanliness, and sugar was stored in wooden barrels that were neither sealed nor sanitized. Flies, ants, and other pests often burrowed into the barrels, leaving behind waste and larvae. This was the first layer of danger. Once in England, sugar underwent refinement, but this process was far from modern standards. Sugar loaves, the conical solid blocks used at the time, were often chipped, powdered, or moulded without sterilization. Workers ground it with stones or metal tools that were reused for years. Dust, dirt, and tiny particles of rust could end up in the sugar, and there was no way to clean it completely. When the Queen ate her sugared confections, she was consuming foreign dirt, insect fragments, and possible contaminants from processing. Poisons invisible to the naked eye but potentially deadly over time. Elizabeth loved sugar in all forms. She ate it in candies, marzipan, sugared fruits, jellies, and elaborate pastries. Confections were sometimes shaped like animals, flowers, or even miniature people. Art meant to impress courtiers, but inside they could hide microbial danger, almond paste for marzipan, spoiled quickly if not stored properly. Honey used to coat candies could ferment or carry bacteria. Even a small bite of sweet glossy sugar could bring a hidden risk of foodborne illness. Her sugar consumption went far beyond simple desserts. Elizabeth's table often featured sugar as part of savoury dishes, sauces, and even meats. Spices and sugar were combined to mask the taste of rotting or stale ingredients. A roast might be glazed with honey and sprinkled with sugar to make it look and taste appealing, even if the meat was already spoiled. To Elizabeth's refined palate, this was luxury, but it was also a vehicle for sickness. Her meals were simultaneously indulgent and dangerous. To make matters worse, sugar consumption had long-term effects on health that were poorly understood at the time. The Queen's teeth, constantly coated in sugar, decayed rapidly. Cavities were painful and common, and dental care in the 16th century was almost non-existent. Rotten teeth could become infected, leading to fevers, swelling, or even death. Historians note that Elizabeth likely suffered from severe tooth decay as she aged, a direct result of her sugar-heavy diet. Sugar also wreaked havoc on digestion. Confections were often rich, oily, and mixed with flour, eggs, or milk. The combination of heavy sweets and already questionable food created stomach issues, constipation, and digestive pain. Sometimes overly sweet sauces were used to cover the sour taste of spoiled ingredients, effectively forcing Elizabeth to consume both decay and sugar at once. This combination could have caused nausea, vomiting, or severe digestive infections. The preparation of sugar-based foods was another hazard. In the royal kitchens, sugar was boiled in large cauldrons or mixed by hand. Utensils were reused, and the workers handling it were rarely clean. Fingers touched the sticky mass repeatedly, introducing bacteria, mold spores, or filth from hands, clothing, or kitchen surfaces. Flies frequently landed on these confections, leaving behind disease-carrying germs. In some cases, sugar itself was used to preserve fruit, creating a sticky environment where molds and fermentation could occur. While it looked perfect on the outside, the inside could harbour harmful microbes. Sweets were also a social danger. Courtiers and servants often handled sugar directly to decorate pastries or marzipan. Fingers passed over food, leaving behind germs. Shared dishes spread contamination across the table. Elizabeth herself might dip a finger into sugar or a pot of honey, unknowingly ingesting pathogens left by another hand. This was a subtle but constant threat. Sugar meant to delight, also spread disease silently. Some of the Queen's most famous indulgences were sugar-coated fruits. Apples, pears, and plums were boiled in syrup or coated with sugar to preserve them longer. But the fruits themselves were rarely clean. They were often bruised, half-rotted, or dust-covered when they arrived at the palace. Coating them in sugar did not sanitize them. Refining processes involved repeated boiling and treatment with lime or ash to clarify the syrup. Residues of these chemicals could remain in the sugar, adding another hidden poison to every bite. Additives were rarely measured or purified, so the Queen might have unknowingly ingested trace amounts of toxic substances alongside her daily doses of sweetness. Even the act of eating sugar posed risk. Sticky candies or marzipan coated her teeth and tongue, attracting bacteria from other foods she'd eaten. The combination of rotten meat, contaminated bread, and sugared confections created a perfect storm for infection. While Elizabeth's constitution was strong, the cumulative effect of years of sugar consumption was likely debilitating, weakening her teeth, stomach, and possibly contributing to infections later in life. Elizabeth's obsession with sugar also reflects the broader danger of Tudor dining. Wealth and status could not protect her from the hidden threats in food. She had access to the finest ingredients, the most skilled chefs, and the most lavish tableware. Yet she was exposed to contaminants invisible to the eye, poisons she could not avoid. Sugar, a symbol of luxury, was at once her delight and her slow-acting enemy. It is chilling to consider how Elizabeth's love for sweetness intersected with her survival. Each piece of marzipan, each sugared fruit, each candied decoration brought pleasure and potential poison. For Elizabeth, sugar was both a weapon and a weakness, a source of pleasure and a source of hidden, relentless risk. In the context of the Tudor table, sugar was not just sweetness. It was a poison disguised as art, a hazard hidden beneath a veil of refinement. Every marzipan animal, every sugared pie, every sweetened sauce was a silent threat. Every fish or eel she ate was swimming in a soup of filth, long before it landed on her plate. Rivers in Elizabethan England were covered with debris, excrement and carcasses. Waste from homes flowed directly into waterways. Toilets were rare and primitive, often simple wooden buckets emptied into the streets or rivers. Sewage, human waste and kitchen scraps all ended up in the same waters where fish were caught. Tanners, dyers and butchers dumped chemicals, blood and offal into rivers. This turned waterways into breeding grounds for bacteria, parasites and disease. Drinking this water was dangerous. Eating fish from it was even more so. Eels were a favourite of the Queen. They were long, slippery and often boiled in stews or baked in pies. But eels thrived in the filthiest waters. They burrowed in mud thick with human and animal waste. They fed on dead matter, insects, and smaller fish that had themselves eaten rotting material. When cooked, eels might look sleek, shiny and rich, but inside they carried a host of pathogens. Parasites, bacteria and toxins could survive like cooking. Consuming eels was essentially consuming the river's filth in a concentrated form. Freshwater fish like carp, pike and perch were similarly risky. Fish caught in slow-moving or stagnant rivers were often covered in slime, their scales coated with mud and debris. Parasites crawled under their skin, invisible to the eye. Worms and small larvae could infest flesh, sometimes hiding in the muscle. Steaming, roasting or boiling might kill some parasites, but bacteria thrived even after cooking. Elizabeth could eat a perfectly roasted pike only to ingest bacteria strong, enough to cause fever, vomiting or diarrhea. Preservation was another hazard. Fish was often salted or pickled to last longer. Large barrels of salted fish were kept in cool pantries or cellars, but salt did not kill all microbes. Maggots, moulds, or invisible bacterial colonies could grow inside a barrel or along the surface of salted fillets. Even pickled fish carried risk. Vinegar, often used to disguise spoilage or add flavour, did not guarantee safety. It masked the smell, allowing rotten fish to appear fresh on the plate. The preparation of fish added another layer of danger. Kitchen staff handled the food with unwashed hands. Knives and cutting boards were reused after chopping meats, bread, or other ingredients. Flies landed on fish, bringing disease from other meals. The sticky scales and slimy surfaces of eels and carp made them perfect carriers for germs. Sometimes, fish were stuffed with spices or sugared sauces intended to impress the court. These additions concealed odours and textures that might have warned diners of spoilage. Elizabeth herself likely could not tell the difference between slightly spoiled fish and one that was fresh, because her taste buds had been trained to accept intense flavours. Fish pies were another horror. Large pies filled with whole fish, slices of eel or minced meat and fish were baked for hours. On the surface, the pastry appeared golden and appetising, but inside, ingredients were often layered with leftover scraps, old fish, and offal. The heat of baking did not always penetrate the thick pie evenly. Some areas remained partially raw, allowing bacteria to survive. A single bite could contain decayed fish, or eels teeming with parasites, invisible to the queen, her courtiers, and even her chefs. The smell of fish in Tudor kitchens was overwhelming. It was masked with vinegar, sugar, and spices, but the stench of rotting flesh, mud, and river grime was pervasive. Flies swarmed in summer, landing on food and leaving. Behind germs, rats often invaded storage areas, nibbling on salted or smoked fish and leaving droppings behind. Servants working in these conditions were carriers of disease themselves, touching food with hands coated in filth from the kitchen floor, the barrels, or the animals they handled. Every course was a risk, every morsel a potential infection. The Queen's fondness for fish was also connected to religious customs. On fasting days, meat was forbidden, but fish was allowed. This meant Elizabeth ate it frequently, sometimes several times a day, without realizing she was exposing herself repeatedly to contamination. While she avoided some meats for religious reasons, she often consumed fish that had been caught in the dirtiest rivers, handled by dozens of contaminated hands and stored in unsanitary conditions. The very act of observing her religious duties increased her exposure to disease. Some fish were imported from distant waters, bringing exotic flavours but new dangers. Herring, for example, was brought from the North Sea and often packed in barrels with minimal preservation. Transportation over rough seas exposed the fish to moisture, heat, and contamination. Salted or smoked fish could harbour moulds or parasites that survived the journey. Exotic imports were symbols of status, but they were far from safe to eat. Even the simplest presentation of fish was deceptive. A well-plated eel or carp might appear clean, shiny, and appetising. A roasted pike, glazed with sugar and decorated with almonds, could be mistaken for perfection. But the beauty of the dish was only skin deep. The interior could be slimy, infested, or contaminated with pathogens that would make even a strong stomach revolt. What Elizabeth saw as refinement and taste was often a mask for decay and danger. The repeated exposure to contaminated fish had real consequences. Historians speculate that Elizabeth and her courtiers suffered from repeated bouts of digestive distress, fever, or intestinal infections. Eels and river fish were particularly risky because of parasites like worms, which were common in contaminated waters. Modern scientists examining the diets of early modern monarchs suggest that such parasites could survive partial cooking, embedding themselves in the intestines and causing long-term health issues. Yet Elizabeth continued to consume these foods. Her love for eels, fish pies, and river fish outweighed the risks. She had access to the finest chefs, the cleanest kitchens, and imported ingredients, but she could not escape the reality of 16th century hygiene. Rivers were open sewers, fish were carriers of disease, kitchens were breeding grounds for bacteria and maggots. Every bite was a calculated risk, a gamble that the Queen somehow survived year after year. The danger of fish in Elizabethan England illustrates the terrifying intersection of luxury, indulgence, and filth. Wealth could secure the finest ingredients, elaborate cooking methods, and careful presentation, but it could not eliminate the invisible threats lurking in the food itself. What appeared on the Queen's plate was a combination of beauty and horror. Shiny eels, golden fish pies, sugared sauces, but beneath the surface, decay, slime, parasites, and disease awaited. Eating fish was not just a pleasure, it was a daily brush with danger, a confrontation with the very filth of Tudor waterways. Elizabeth's aquatic diet was a mirror of her world, dazzling and dangerous, elegant and deadly. The rivers that nourished her also carried contamination. The eels she loved were as filthy as the mud they emerged from. The pies she savoured hid decay beneath golden pastry. And yet, like with meat, sugar, and bread, she survived. She faced the filth of her kingdom daily, eating with confidence while the hazards of her meals went unnoticed, or perhaps underestimated. The Queen's appetite for fish reveals a shocking truth. Even the most refined and powerful person could not escape the dangers of Tudor food. Luxury could hide rot, wealth could hide filth, and beauty could hide disease, but it could not destroy it. In the end, Elizabeth's consumption of fish and eels shows the terrifying reality of early modern dining. Rivers were sewers, kitchens were infested, and every meal carried the risk of infection. Yet the Queen persevered, dining on the filthiest foods imaginable, surviving in a world where commoners often died from the very same dishes. Her aquatic meals were both indulgent and perilous, a testament to the resilience of her body and the hidden horrors of Tudor England. When most people think of pies, they imagine sweet fruit fillings, golden crusts, or savoury meat encased in flaky pastry. For Queen Elizabeth I, pies were something very different. At the Tudor table, pies were symbols of wealth and power, but they were also secret vessels of rot and contamination. The meats, fish, and even vegetables baked inside them were often spoiled, teeming with bacteria, or crawling with insects. Every bite carried hidden danger, and yet the Queen ate them with pleasure, unaware, or perhaps unbothered by the risks. The construction of a Tudor pie was itself a challenge to health. Pies were enormous, sometimes as large as a small loaf of bread, with thick pastry walls designed more to preserve than to delight. But these crusts, called coffins, were often made in bulk days in advance. Flour was contaminated with insect, dust, or mould. Butter or lard was reused from previous meals, sometimes partially spoiled, and sugar or spices were sticky with germs. The shell, intended to protect the filling, could trap bacteria and allow slow rot to continue inside. Fillings were even worse. Meats were the most common, but they were rarely fresh. Roasts, leftover cuts, game birds, or fish were chopped and packed into pies. A pheasant that had been stored for days might be mixed with beef that had begun to sour. Spices and sugar were added to mask the odour, but they did nothing to stop bacterial growth. Often, offal, heart, liver, kidney, was added as a delicacy, even though these organs spoiled faster than muscle meat. A single pie could contain multiple meats at different stages of decay, layered with spices and sweeteners to hide the stench. Fish pies were equally horrifying. Eels, carp, and pike, often caught in polluted rivers, were combined with leftover meats or offal. The resulting mixture was baked inside thick pastry, sometimes for hours, but uneven heat left pockets of partially raw or spoiled food. Parasites, worms, and bacteria survived the cooking process. A bite of fish pie could deliver a cocktail of pathogens directly to the stomach, invisible to the eye and undetectable to the taste buds under layers of sugar and spices. Even pies filled with fruits and vegetables were dangerous. Produce in Tudor England was rarely clean. Apples, pears, plums, or berries were bruised, half rotted or dust covered when they arrived at the palace. Cooking in the pie did not eliminate all risks. Some fruits fermented, developing a sour taste and harbouring bacteria. Vegetables boiled or roasted in reused water from previous meals carried contaminants from meat or offal. When enclosed in pastry, these foods created a dark, moist environment perfect for mould growth. The sheer size and variety of pies added to the danger. Pies were often served as centerpieces at banquets, sometimes weighing tens of pounds. They were carved and served by several servants, with knives and hands that had touched dozens of other foods. Cross-contamination was inevitable. A slice taken from one part of the pie might contain clean meat, while a slice from another contained partially decayed leftovers. Elizabeth and her courtiers had no way of knowing which bite carried sickness. Sugar and spices were commonly added to pies, creating the illusion of safety. A heavily sugared pie smelled sweet, tasted rich, and appeared golden and inviting. But this sweetness was a mask. Sugar does not kill bacteria. It only hides odours. Spices like cloves, mace, and cinnamon were sprinkled over the top to impress the eyes and palate, making the pie seem refined and luxurious. Yet inside, decay could be rampant. Historians believe that pies were a major source of foodborne illness at court, causing stomach pain, vomiting and fever among the staff, and sometimes even the Queen herself. Preparation was another problem. Kitchens were infested with flies, rats, and mice. Servants handling pies had dirty hands, touched contaminated surfaces, and passed utensils between dishes without washing. Wooden boards used to roll dough were riddled with grooves that trapped old food particles, fat, and bacteria. Pies baked in large brick ovens were often placed next to roasts, breads, or fish, allowing cross-contamination to continue even during cooking. Every step of making a pie, from chopping and mixing to baking and serving, introduced new risks. Leftovers were incorporated into pies as well. Meat scraps, fish trimmings, or spoiled vegetables were often saved from previous meals and hidden under layers of pastry. A pie might contain ingredients from multiple days, each carrying its own risk of decay. The spices and sugar were used as a mask, creating the illusion of freshness. But in reality, each pie was a concentrated collection of rot, decay, and microbial life. Elizabeth's chefs prided themselves on their skill at disguising these horrors. To them, a pie that looked appealing and tasted good, even if slightly off, was a success. Some pies were used for show as much as for food. Elaborate creations were moulded into shapes of animals, ships, or castles. The exterior looked flawless, the crust golden, the decorations intricate. Inside, however, the filling could be a horrifying mixture of meats, fish, and offal at different stages of spoilage. Courtiers admired the artistry while unknowingly risking illness with each bite. The Queen herself was captivated by these displays, consuming the pies with delight, unaware of the hidden dangers beneath the pastry. Even the act of carving pies was risky. Large knives passed through thick layers of meat, fish, and offal, potentially carrying bacteria from one layer to another. Servants' hands, often sweaty and grimy, touched the filling as they served slices. A pie shared between 10 courtiers could distribute microbes to every plate, multiplying the risk. The Queen, eating from a slice handled by several people, faced the concentrated hazard of decay and contamination with each mouthful. The consequences were real. Pies filled with meat and fish were likely responsible for many cases of food poisoning at court. Stomach pain, nausea, vomiting, and fever were common after meals. The Queen herself may have experienced occasional digestive distress from these dishes, though her strong constitution often allowed her to recover. Still, the pies represent a horrifying intersection of luxury, decay, and danger. The very foods that displayed wealth and power were simultaneously a source of risk and illness. Even the most lavish pies could not escape the reality of Tudor hygiene. Kitchens were infested, utensils were dirty, and ingredients were partially spoiled before even reaching the oven. Baking in a hot oven could kill some bacteria but often left pockets of raw or decayed food intact. The thick pastry trapped heat but also moisture, creating an environment in which parasites or molds could survive. A pie might look perfect for hours, but inside it could be a concentrated trap of rot. Elizabeth's pies were not just food, they were daily confrontations with danger, meat, fish, offal, fruits, and vegetables all layered together, hidden by spices and sugar baked into golden pastry. Every bite was a potential infection. Every slice could deliver decay and disease. Yet the Queen ate them regularly, displaying refinement, wealth, and appetite, while unknowingly consuming hazards that would have killed or sickened most ordinary people. In short, pies at Elizabeth's table were a paradox, symbols of elegance and power, yet filled with decay and invisible threats. They were a testament to the ingenuity of Tudor chefs and the fragility of Tudor hygiene, beauty, taste, and luxury masked, filth, rot, and danger. The Queen's indulgence in pies reveals the terrifying truth of her diet. What appeared golden and perfect was often foul, contaminated, and capable of causing illness. Tudor pies were a silent hazard, a daily reminder that even the most powerful monarchs could not escape the filth, rot, and contamination of their world. They were edible works of art, yes, but art that contained hidden poisons, microbial life, and decay. Elizabeth's consumption of these pies shows both the risks of her meals and the astonishing resilience of her body. Every slice she ate was a small battle with death, yet she continued year after year, dining on luxury that hid horror at every layer. When most people imagine Queen Elizabeth III's table, they think of lavish roasts, pies, and sugared desserts. But fruits and vegetables, often thought of today as clean and healthy, were another source of hidden danger in Tudor England. What appeared fresh, colourful, and appetising was often contaminated, rotten, or soaked in filthy water. Even the Queen's careful chefs could not completely eliminate the risks. In Elizabeth's world, produce was a gamble. One bite could bring decay, disease, or even death. Fruits were prized in Elizabethan England not only for taste, but for status. Apples, pears, plums, cherries, and figs were brought to the court from palace gardens, local orchards, or imported from Europe. But their journey from tree or orchard to table was treacherous. Transportation was slow and unsanitary. Fruits were carried in wooden baskets, crates, or sacks that had previously held grains, vegetables, or even meat scraps. Dust, soil, and insect larvae clung to every surface. Bruised or overripe fruits were often included in shipments because appearances mattered less than quantity and cost. Once at the palace, fruits were washed, or at least rinsed, in water that was rarely clean. Wells in London could be contaminated with human and animal waste, stagnant rainwater, or runoff from slaughterhouses. Servants would dip fruits quickly into buckets of water, often reusing the same water for dozens of apples or pears. This washing often spread more germs than it removed. A fruit that looked glossy and fresh on the outside could still be carrying parasites, bacteria, or even chemical residues from soil treated with ash or lime. Even peeled fruits were not safe. Knives were reused on meats, breads, and pastries before touching apples or pears. Wooden cutting boards, grooved and worn from years of use, harboured bacteria and bits of old food. Flies swarmed around the preparation area, landing on fruits after visiting rotting meat or fish. Each step of handling introduced contaminants. Elizabeth may have thought she was eating something pure and healthy, but in reality she was consuming a combination of natural sugars, decay, and disease. Vegetables were perhaps even more dangerous. Common vegetables like cabbages, leeks, carrots, onions, and peas were often boiled before serving, but the water used for boiling was typically reused multiple times for different dishes. Imagine a cauldron where meat had been boiled in the morning, followed by offal in the afternoon and vegetables by evening. The water carried fat, blood, bacteria and residue from previous meals. Boiling vegetables in this water could remove some dirt, but did nothing to sterilize pathogens. A supposedly clean cabbage might be teeming with microbial life. Leafy greens were a nightmare. Spinach, lettuce, and herbs were grown in gardens that were fertilized with human or animal waste. This practice, common in the 16th century, ensured that crops were nutritious, but also that they carried parasites like roundworms or bacteria such as E. coli. Washing the leaves in dirty water did little to remove the risk. By the time the greens were served at the Queen's table, they were coated with germs invisible to the naked eye. Eating them, raw or even lightly cooked, was a dangerous gamble. Fruits and vegetables were often preserved in sugar, vinegar, or alcohol to extend shelf life. While this masked odours and made produce more visually appealing, it did not guarantee safety. Fermentation could occur inside a jar of preserved fruit, producing alcohol and bacteria. Mould could grow in thick layers under fruit skins or along the edges of preserved containers. Sugar and spices were used to disguise the smell, creating a false sense of cleanliness. A jar of sugared plums or spiced pears might look perfect, but inside, rot and microbial life were thriving. Imported fruits were not exempt from danger. Oranges, lemons, and figs came by ship from warmer climates. Long journeys exposed them to heat, moisture, and physical damage. Mould could develop in transit, insects could burrow into skins, and juices could ferment. When the fruits arrived at court, they were often stored in wooden boxes or barrels alongside other foods, further increasing contamination risks. The exotic appearance and scent of these fruits gave no clue to their hidden dangers. Even the act of eating fruit was risky. Queen Elizabeth and her courtiers often handled the produce with bare hands, passing apples or pears around the table. Shared dishes meant shared bacteria. Juices could drip onto other foods, contaminating pies, meat, or bread. Flies that had landed on the table, on meats, or in kitchens could touch the fruit and transmit disease. The Queen's reputation for refinement required her to handle the fruit delicately, but the act of handling itself increased exposure to microbes. Some fruits were peeled, sliced, or cooked in sugar syrups, but preparation often worsened the risks. A knife that cut a plum might have touched raw meat or fish earlier. Wooden boards soaked in water from earlier boiling sessions could carry bacteria directly onto the fruit. Boiling or poaching removed some germs, but thick skins or dense flesh could protect microbes, leaving dangerous pathogens intact. The Queen's enjoyment of candied fruits or tarts often combined the hazards of both sugar and produce, double exposure to risk. Vegetables were similarly deceptive. Roasted or boiled, they could hide worms or larvae in folds and stems. Root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, onions, often carried soil full of bacteria. Insects, larvae, and dust clung to skins. Even after peeling and cooking, some pathogens survived. Herbs added for flavour could also carry contaminants. Thyme, parsley, and mint were harvested by hand, often in fields fertilised with human or animal waste, and added directly to soups or sauces without washing. Every bite contained unseen dangers. Storage added another layer of risk. Fruits and vegetables were kept in cool pantries, but temperatures fluctuated and pests were everywhere. Rats and mice gnawed at barrels, baskets, and stored produce. Maggots could develop in bruised or overripe fruits. Flies laid eggs on vegetables left out overnight. Spoilage could occur quickly, turning once fresh produce into a bacterial time bomb. Yet appearance was everything. Any blemishes were hidden under sugar, spices, or slicing techniques, so the Queen rarely saw evidence of decay. Even washing produce could spread disease rather than prevent it. A single bucket of water might be used for dozens of fruits or vegetables. Dirt, bacteria, and microscopic parasites were transferred from one item to the next. The illusion of cleanliness created a false sense of safety, while the actual risk increased with each reuse. Elizabeth, accustomed to the sight of sparkling polished foods, may have assumed the fruits and vegetables were safe, never knowing how much filth and decay remained. The Queen's appetite for exotic and domestic produce also magnified the risks. Every meal could include a combination of contaminated fruits, vegetables boiled in reused water, sugared preserves, and herbs harvested from fertilized gardens. This was a daily exposure to pathogens, parasites, and bacteria. Her strong constitution and careful selection of certain dishes likely helped her survive, but her diet demonstrates how even seemingly healthy foods were dangerous. In essence, Elizabeth's fruits and vegetables were a form of false cleanliness. They looked clean, colourful, and edible, but their appearance hid contamination, rot, and disease. From bruised apples to boiled cabbage, sugared plums to raw herbs, the Queen's produce was riddled with invisible hazards. Her enjoyment of these foods was both indulgent and risky, revealing a shocking truth. Even what seemed natural, healthy, and safe could be deadly in Tudor England. The lesson of fruits and vegetables at Elizabeth's table is clear. Hygiene was nearly non-existent. Water was contaminated, soil carried parasites, handling spread bacteria, preservation masked decay. Appearance could deceive even the most refined palate, and yet the Queen consumed these foods daily, demonstrating a remarkable resilience in the face of constant danger. In short, Elizabeth's produce was a gamble with death. Every fruit and vegetable on her table, whether peeled, boiled, sugared, or baked, was hiding contamination, spoilage, or parasites. Luxury and refinement masked danger, but did not eliminate it. The Queen's survival in the face of these risks shows the extraordinary hazards of Tudor dining and the invisible threats lurking in even the most innocent-looking foods. In today's world, we think of table manners as politeness, napkins, forks, and small bites. In Elizabeth Therm's court, table manners were both a ritual of power and a hidden threat to health. The way the Queen and her courtiers ate created ideal conditions for spreading disease. Each gesture, each shared dish, each ornate banquet became a vehicle for contamination, turning etiquette into a silent weapon. The Tudor dining table was a crowded, chaotic stage. Elizabeth's meals were public displays of wealth and influence. Dozens of courtiers, nobles, and servants surrounded the table, each eager to see the Queen, each hoping to gain favour. Food was placed on large platters in the centre, meant to be shared. There were no individual plates for every diner. Instead, multiple hands reached for the same dish, sometimes touching the food directly. Spices, sauces, and glazes were applied by servants who often dipped fingers into the same pots used repeatedly throughout the day. Every touch was an opportunity to transmit bacteria, parasites, or rot. Forks, as we know them, were almost unknown. Most eating was done with fingers or spoons. Knife use was common, but knives were used for multiple courses and rarely cleaned properly between uses. The same knife might cut meat, fish, and bread, then touch pastries or fruits. Wooden spoons, bowls, and platters were also reused. Their surfaces, grooved and scarred from years of service, trapped food, residue, bacteria, and decay. A single utensil could carry microbes from rotting meat directly to sugar-coated confections or delicate fruit. Hand-washing was inconsistent at best. Before meals, some servants might rinse hands quickly in cold water, but soap was rare, and running water almost non-existent. During the meal, fingers touched everything: bread, pies, meat, sugar, fruits, and sauces. A noble might pass a piece of meat from one hand to another, unaware of contamination. A servant might use a finger to test the temperature of a sauce, then stir the same pot again. The Queen herself, with her delicate manners, often touched food with fingers or tasted dishes directly with her spoon. Every gesture amplified the risk of infection. Sharing dishes was a major hazard. Platters of meat, fish, or pies were passed around the table. A noble might take a slice, then hand the platter to another, leaving saliva, bacteria, or small particles behind. Even the Queen's gestures contributed. If she tasted a dish before it was served, a common practice to ensure its flavour, she could inadvertently transfer germs to the entire meal. Court etiquette required shared tasting and communal dining, multiplying the chances of disease spreading. Sauces were another problem. Rich gravies, sweet syrups, and spiced glazes were often reused. A single pot of sauce could be applied to multiple dishes over the course of a meal, spices and sugar-masked odours making it impossible to detect spoilage, but they did not kill bacteria. Servants dipping fingers or ladles into these sauces repeatedly spread microbes from one course to another. A slice of pie might be coated with gravy that had touched spoiled meat, fish, or offal moments earlier. Each bite was a gamble. Seating arrangements also amplified contamination. Nobles and courtiers often crowded together on benches without personal space. Elbows brushed, hands collided, and platters were jostled. Food crumbs fell onto clothing, hands, or floors, where they were later retrieved or swept back into circulation by servants. Rats and mice scuttled beneath tables, contaminating fallen crumbs that might eventually be placed back on the plate. Flies swarmed in summer, moving freely between meat, fruit, and sugar. Each person's presence increased the microbial load on the table, and the Queen was at the centre of it all. Even the etiquette of drinking contributed to disease. Cups, goblets, and flagons were often shared. Elizabeth and her courtiers might sip from the same cup or wine vessel. Servants could add wine to a communal flagon without cleaning it. Saliva, germs, and even vomit traces could spread rapidly from hand to hand, mouth to mouth. Drinking in this way multiplied the exposure to disease far more than eating alone ever could. Courtiers were also expected to eat with speed and display appetite. Hesitation or refusal to consume a dish could signal weakness or disrespect. This cultural pressure meant that even if a dish looked suspicious, contained a foul odour or seemed stale, nobles and servants often forced it into their mouths. The Queen's approval was paramount. Rejecting food risked social disaster. As a result, everyone at the table, including Elizabeth, ingested potentially hazardous food without hesitation. Hand gestures too were risky. Spices and sugar were often applied with fingers. Meat pies or large roasts were carved by hand, then distributed directly. Courtiers might pick at the food with fingers before taking a proper bite. Sauces were shared with bread, and bread dipped into sauces transferred microbes freely. Any minor cut, scrape, or abrasion on a hand could introduce infection directly into the bloodstream. Infections like tetanus or gangrene were common in the 16th century and could start from something as small as handling contaminated food. The utensils themselves amplified the danger. Knives were sharpened with whetstones that also housed bacteria. Wooden spoons soaked in hot water but never scrubbed carried old food residue for days. Platters made of wood, pewter, or silver were polished for appearance, but polishing did not remove microbes. Metal knives and pewter plates sometimes leached toxic metals into the food, adding chemical danger to biological risk. Elizabeth dined amidst this invisible cocktail of contamination every day. Even the act of cleaning up was hazardous. Plates and utensils were rarely washed thoroughly. Food scraps were collected and reused. Sauces and gravies kept for the next meal, and crumbs swept back into the pantry. Flies landed on these leftovers. Rats scavenged in pantries, and servants carried microbes between kitchens and dining halls. Every day the table became a cycle of contamination, spreading invisible disease from one meal to the next. The Queen's behaviour reinforced risk. She often tasted dishes before they were served, sampled sauces with her fingers, and encouraged tasting among her courtiers. This practice, meant to demonstrate refinement and control over the meal, actually multiplied exposure. Each touch, each shared plate, each tasting created a web of microbial transfer. In effect, Elizabeth's etiquette was a vector for infection, ritualized, refined, and invisible. The cumulative effect of these practices cannot be overstated. Between contaminated foods, shared dishes, unwashed hands, reused utensils, and flies swarming overhead, every meal was a public health nightmare. Historians note that stomach illnesses, fevers, and digestive disturbances were common at court, likely caused by these very practices. The Queen may have suffered occasional stomach pains, nausea, or fatigue, though her strong constitution allowed her to survive. For everyone else, these conditions were far deadlier. Table manners in Tudor England were not just rituals of politeness, they were instruments of risk. Every expectation of etiquette, from shared platters to communal tasting, inadvertently spread disease. The Queen's court, celebrated for refinement and luxury, was a breeding ground for bacteria, parasites, and rot. Even a simple act like breaking bread, tasting sauce, or passing a dish could transmit illness across the table. Elizabeth and her courtiers dined at the intersection of elegance and danger, where wealth and status could not protect them from the invisible threats their manners amplified. In short, Elizabeth's table manners created a hidden hazard. The Queen dined amidst flies, rats, contaminated utensils, spoiled food, and the sweat and germs of dozens of people. Etiquette demanded shared dishes, tasting, and elaborate service, which spread disease silently and efficiently. Luxury masked rot, refinement hid contamination, and beauty disguised danger. Yet Elizabeth survived, navigating a dining world where manners and rituals were themselves vectors of illness. Her table shows a horrifying truth. Even with wealth, power, and access to the finest ingredients, human behaviour can amplify danger. Each bite of meat, slice of pie, or piece of fruit was a risk, but the social rules governing Elizabeth's meals ensured that risk spread far beyond the individual, affecting everyone at court. In this world, refinement and danger were inseparable. Elizabeth's resilience in the face of these risks is staggering. She survived years of exposure to spoiled food, contaminated water, reused utensils, flies, rats, and human germs. Her table manners, meant to demonstrate poise and sophistication, amplified hidden dangers at every meal. Every banquet was a silent gamble with death, and yet she lived to rule England for decades, a queen both elegant and imperiled, thriving amidst the filth and decay that surrounded her. When we think of Elizabeth Thuam's indulgence, wine, ale, and beer might come to mind. But the drinks she consumed were far more dangerous than even the rotting meats, contaminated pies, or river fish on her table. In Tudor England, liquids were often more hazardous than solid foods. Water was filthy. Ale and wine were contaminated. Herbal infusions were brewed in unsanitary conditions. Every sip carried a hidden risk: bacteria, parasites, toxins, and even chemical poisons that could make a person sick or kill them. And yet, Elizabeth drank daily, indulging in beverages that today would be considered deadly. Water was the most obvious hazard. It was scarce in London and heavily contaminated. Rivers and streams were open sewers. Human waste, animal feces, industrial runoff from tanners and dyers, and blood from slaughterhouses flowed freely into waterways. Wells often drew from shallow sources contaminated by nearby cesspits. Drinking this water was not only unpleasant, it was deadly. Waterborne diseases like dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and parasitic infections were common. Yet the Queen sometimes drank it, boiled lightly or diluted, or used it in cooking, unknowingly risking infection. Ale and beer were considered safer than water, but they were hardly sterile. Brewing methods in the 16th century were primitive. Ale was made by fermenting grains in large barrels, often in kitchens or storage rooms frequented by rats and flies. Yeast cultures were wild, and brewers reused equipment without thorough cleaning. Barrels contained residue from previous batches. The drink might contain mold, bacterial contamination, or even insects trapped during fermentation. Alcohol slowed bacterial growth, but it did not eliminate all pathogens. A sip of ale could easily carry harmful microbes, especially if barrels were left uncovered or handled by dirty hands. Wine was another luxury with hidden danger. Imported from France, Spain and Portugal, wine travelled long distances in barrels that were reused multiple times. Seawater splashed on barrels. Barrels were stacked in filthy hold spaces, and the liquid could become contaminated with mould, bacteria, or chemicals from the barrel wood. Some wines were fortified with spices or sugar which masked odours of spoilage but did nothing to remove microbes. Even when bottled, corks were imperfect, and storage conditions were inconsistent. Drinking wine at court might impress the senses, but it was an invisible hazard. Courtly drinking vessels added to the risk. Cups, goblets, and flagons were rarely washed thoroughly. Silver or pewter could harbour bacteria in scratches and grooves. Wooden cups retained residue. When multiple people used the same vessel, germs and saliva spread effortlessly. Elizabeth and her courtiers frequently sipped from communal vessels or tasted drinks before serving, unknowingly distributing pathogens across the table. Sharing a cup of wine or ale was effectively sharing an invisible cocktail of disease. Juices and syrups carried their own threats. Fruit juices were extracted by hand, often using unwashed tools and stored in containers that could harbour mould or bacteria. Sugar syrups used in drinks were sticky breeding grounds for microbes. Honey, a common sweetener, could ferment or carry spores of Clostridium botulinum, a dangerous bacterium. Fruit-infused wines or punches looked delicious, but were hazardous, with every ingredient contributing to contamination. The Queen may have enjoyed their flavour, unaware of the invisible threat in every sip. Herbal teas and infusions were no safer. Herbs were gathered from gardens, fertilised with human or animal waste, and then steeped in water that was often contaminated. Mint, thyme and parsley could carry bacteria or parasites. Even boiling water for a short time did not guarantee sterilisation. Infusions were sometimes flavoured with sugar, spices, or honey, creating a warm, sweet drink that seemed harmless. In reality, each cup could harbour pathogens capable of causing severe digestive distress or long-term infection. Temperature made a difference, but not enough to ensure safety. Hot drinks might kill some bacteria, but thick syrups, dense fruit mixtures, or partially fermented beverages could protect microbes. Ale, beer and wine were often consumed at room temperature or slightly chilled, meaning many pathogens survived ingestion. Even hot punches or mulled wines could retain pockets of microbial life, hidden beneath the sugar, spices or alcohol. Every sip carried risk. Storage conditions amplified the danger. Drinks were kept in barrels, flagons and jars in cellars, pantries or kitchens where rats, flies and mice roamed freely. Dust, debris and insect eggs often fell into containers. Spills were wiped with cloths that had touched meat, fish or bread. Residue from previous batches created a microbial environment ideal for growth. A single flagon of wine could carry multiple strains of bacteria, fungi or parasites. Drinking it was like playing roulette with disease. Servants handling beverages also contributed to contamination. They dipped hands into sugar, stirred syrups with unwashed spoons and poured liquids from shared vessels. Spills on tables, floors and other foods spread germs further. Even careful pouring could not prevent disease transmission because the entire environment, from kitchen to table, was rife with invisible threats. Each glass or cup became a vehicle for cross-contamination. Communal drinking intensified exposure. Guests, courtiers and the Queen often drank from the same cups or flagons. Saliva, germs and microbes passed from person to person. Even a tiny sip left behind traces of pathogens for the next drinker. Courtly etiquette, which encouraged sharing and tasting, inadvertently created a network of infection, silently multiplying risk. The Queen, at the centre of this network, was repeatedly exposed to bacteria, parasites, and decay from everyone around her. The composition of beverages added chemical risks as well. Some wines and syrups were adulterated with toxic metals, lead salts or other chemicals intended to preserve flavour or colour. Pewter cups and vessels could leach lead into acidic drinks like wine or fruit punches. Alcoholic beverages in particular could enhance the absorption of these toxins, slowly poisoning the drinker over time. Every sip contained both biological and chemical hazards, a double threat that Elizabeth consumed regularly. Even modern precautions would have failed. The combination of contaminated water, alcoholic beverages, herbal infusions, fruit juices, syrups, reused containers, shared cups, and human handling created a perfect storm. Microbial life thrived in every drink, from bacteria to parasites to molds. Alcohol, sugar, and spices might mask odour or taste, but they did not eliminate pathogens. Every swallow was a tiny gamble with disease, invisible yet omnipresent. Elizabeth's consumption of these drinks demonstrates the terrifying hidden dangers of Tudor dining. Liquids, which we think of as cleansing or purifying, were in fact carriers of decay and contamination. The Queen drank alongside her courtiers, surrounded by flies, rats, unwashed hands, and spoiled ingredients. Each beverage, from water to wine, ale to herbal infusion, was laden with risk. Yet she survived year after year, consuming what would have been deadly for ordinary people. The danger of drinks in Elizabethan England was magnified by the Queen's lifestyle. She consumed beverages frequently, sometimes multiple times per day, often alongside meals of spoiled meat, pies, and river fish. This constant exposure, combined with poor sanitation, flies, rats, and human handling, meant that every day presented a new challenge to her health. Her resilience was remarkable, but the risks were invisible, cumulative, and ever-present. In conclusion, Elizabeth's drinks were worse than her food. Water carried disease. Ale and beer harboured bacteria and insects. Wine could contain mould and toxins. Syrups and sugar masked decay. Herbal teas carried parasites. Shared cups spread germs. Storage conditions invited rats and flies, and utensils amplified contamination. Every sip was a gamble with invisible enemies. While wealth, power, and courtly status provided some protection, they could not eliminate the hazards of Tudor beverages. Drinking was not a pleasure. It was a confrontation with danger, a daily brush with decay and disease. Elizabeth's survival, despite this constant exposure, is astonishing. Her beverages, like her meals, were a mix of luxury, indulgence, and hidden peril. They reveal a shocking reality. In Tudor England, even liquid meant for refreshment was a vector for disease, decay, and contamination. Luxury, refinement, and wealth could disguise the dangers, but they could not remove them. Every sip carried the risk of sickness, yet the Queen drank freely, ruling over a court in which every meal, every drink, and every gesture could kill. After examining Elizabeth III's diet, rotting meats, eels from filthy, rivers, pies stuffed with decay, spoiled fruits and vegetables, sugar teeming with bacteria, and drinks carrying invisible poisons, it seems almost impossible that she survived. For any ordinary person in Tudor England, consuming even a fraction of these foods and beverages daily would likely have been fatal. Yet Elizabeth lived to the age of 69, ruling England for decades in a time when the average life expectancy was less than 40. How did she endure a lifetime of these invisible threats? The answer lies in a combination of extraordinary luck, strong constitution, careful habits, and subtle advantages that most people did not have. First, Elizabeth possessed an unusually resilient body. Historians and medical experts who have studied her life agree that she had remarkable natural immunity. She survived childhood illnesses, likely including smallpox, without serious lasting damage. Her digestive system may have been particularly strong, able to handle spoiled or contaminated food better than most. Her immune system could tolerate infections that would have incapacitated or killed ordinary citizens, giving her a survival advantage that seemed miraculous to her contemporaries. But natural resilience alone was not enough. Elizabeth's wealth and status provided advantages that commoners did not have. While her food was dangerous by modern standards, it was generally of higher quality than what peasants ate. She had access to imported spices, sugar, and preserved foods that masked spoilage and made ingestion more palatable. She also had constant access to cooks and servants who were trained to disguise rot and prepare food in ways that reduced the most obvious hazards. Bread was baked daily. Pies were fresh and decorated to look appetizing. Meats and fish, while sometimes spoiled, were often selected from the better portions. Though still contaminated by modern hygiene standards, her diet was carefully curated to reduce immediate threats. Elizabeth also benefited from careful observation and selective consumption. She learned early to avoid obviously dangerous foods. She might reject meat that smelled rancid or fruit that was slimy or mouldy. While her taste buds were trained to tolerate some decay, she had a keen sense of which dishes were more likely to make her ill. Courtiers and cooks were aware that displeasing the queen with foul food could be dangerous, so they often presented only the best portions, even if they were still far from safe. This selective consumption reduced her exposure to the worst hazards, though it could not eliminate them entirely. Her daily habits also contributed to survival. Elizabeth maintained a strict eating schedule, which may have helped her digestion. She ate slowly, tasted foods carefully, and sometimes avoided indulgence in extreme excess. While she certainly consumed rotting pies, sugar-laden desserts, and fish from polluted rivers, she did not gorge recklessly on every dish, which would have increased the likelihood of fatal infection. Instead, she exercised an instinctive moderation that her body could handle, rare wisdom in a court devoted to display and indulgence. Another factor was her exposure to disease in small, manageable doses. Elizabeth's court was full of contamination, flies, rats, unwashed hands, spoiled food. But these threats, while constant, were rarely concentrated enough to be immediately lethal. Her body was exposed repeatedly to low doses of pathogens. This repeated exposure may have strengthened her immune system, giving her resistance to illnesses that could kill others. Essentially, she was building immunity through daily risk, surviving the invisible hazards that surrounded her. Sanitation, though primitive, was slightly better at court than for ordinary people. The royal household had access to better water sources, albeit limited, and waste management, though imperfect, was slightly more controlled. Servants were trained to handle food in ways that reduced the most obvious contamination. Washing hands occasionally, boiling some water and storing leftovers more carefully. While flies, rats, and human error could not be eliminated, Elizabeth benefited from an environment slightly less dangerous than the streets or taverns outside the palace walls. Her relative cleanliness, compared to commoners, was another layer of protection. Her longevity may also have been influenced by diet variety. Despite the dangers, Elizabeth's meals included a mix of nutrients. Meat, fish, eggs, fruits, vegetables, sugar and spices provided a range of calories, proteins and vitamins. Even if contaminated, these foods sustained her body. Her indulgence in certain foods, like sugared fruits or well-cooked pies, gave her calories and energy that might have offset the occasional gastrointestinal distress caused by bacteria or parasites. Nutrition and resilience worked together in an environment where survival depended on both strength and the ability to recover from minor infections. Genetics also played a role. Elizabeth came from a line of survivors. Her father, Henry VIII, lived to 55 despite multiple health problems and repeated injuries. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed, but historical records suggest she was robust during her short life. Elizabeth may have inherited genetic traits that favoured strong immunity, efficient digestion, and the ability to survive exposure to pathogens common in Tudor England. Combined with her careful habits, wealth, and instincts, these inherited traits gave her a significant survival advantage. Another factor was the psychological aspect. Elizabeth's careful attention to her food, combined with her constant vigilance over her health, may have contributed to survival. She observed her body's reactions, avoided foods that made her ill, and used spices, sugar, and sauces not just for taste, but as protective measures. She may have intuitively understood that certain combinations of flavours, cooking methods, and preparation techniques reduced risk, even if she did not understand microbes. Her awareness of her diet, even in primitive terms, gave her control in a dangerous environment. Luck played a role as well. Exposure to spoiled meat, contaminated water, or parasites is partly a matter of chance. The Queen could have been struck by typhoid, dysentery, or a lethal infection at any point, yet she survived repeated exposure. Historical records suggest she occasionally experienced digestive distress, fever, or discomfort, but she recovered. Her survival was a delicate balance between strength, careful consumption, and sheer fortune, a combination that could not be replicated by the average Tudor citizen. Finally, the court itself provided an indirect form of protection. The presence of skilled cooks, numerous servants, and controlled meals meant that Elizabeth's food, though dangerous, was more consistent than that of peasants. Meals were prepared by trained hands, sometimes boiled, baked, or spiced to mask spoilage. Storage and presentation were carefully managed. The Queen's vigilance, combined with the structured preparation of her meals, reduced some risks that would have been fatal to ordinary people. This combination of management, instinct, and selective exposure allowed her to survive decades of dining in a world where disease lurked in every bite. In essence, Elizabeth's survival was a perfect storm of factors: extraordinary immunity, careful selection of food, moderated consumption, relative hygiene at court, variety in diet, psychological vigilance, genetics, and luck. Any one of these factors alone might not have sufficed, but together they allowed the Queen to navigate the constant hazards of Tudor dining. Every meal, every sip, every pie, and every bite of fruit or fish carried invisible threats. Yet she endured, ruling England for decades. Her resilience highlights the shocking reality of Tudor life. Ordinary people faced the same foods and beverages but lacked immunity, careful observation, or protective status. Many died young from spoiled food, contaminated water, or parasites. Elizabeth, surrounded by the same dangers, survived, illustrating both her extraordinary constitution and the fragility of human life in her era. While her wealth and status provided some protection, survival depended on more than privilege. It depended on resilience, instinct, and fortune in a world dominated by decay, contamination, and invisible threats. In conclusion, Elizabeth I's survival was nothing short of miraculous. She consumed rotten meats, decayed pies, contaminated fruits and vegetables, sugar teeming with bacteria, river fish crawling with parasites, and beverages carrying invisible pathogens, every day for decades. Yet her body endured. Her immunity, habits, nutrition, genetics, careful selection, and sheer luck allowed her to navigate a lifetime of hidden hazards. The Queen's survival is a testament to human resilience in the face of constant danger, showing that even in a world filled with decay, disease, and filth, some individuals could endure and thrive against the odds. Elizabeth I's life reminds us of a terrifying truth. Luxury, refinement, and power could not eliminate the dangers of Tudor food. They could mask them, make them palatable, and reduce immediate risk. But the hazards were real, pervasive, and invisible. And yet, against all odds, the Queen survived, a figure of astonishing endurance in a world where ordinary people often succumb to the very meals she enjoyed. Queen Elizabeth thus lived surrounded by decay, filth, and invisible threats. Every meal she ate, from rotting meat and pies filled with maggots to sugared fruits and contaminated water, was a gamble with death. Her survival was a miracle of resilience, luck, and careful instinct. In a world where ordinary people often died young from the food they consumed, Elizabeth thrived, ruling England for decades. Her table was a stage of luxury hiding horror. Sugar that carried bacteria, fish from polluted rivers, vegetables fertilized with human waste, pies packed with decay, and drinks teeming with pathogens. Even etiquette, meant to display refinement, spread disease silently. Every bite and sip challenged her body, yet she endured, a queen who dined daily amidst danger invisible to the eye. Elizabeth's story reveals the shocking reality of Tudor life. Wealth and power could mask threats, but could not eliminate them. The dangers were constant, pervasive, and hidden. Decay in every dish, contamination in every drink, risk in every gesture. She survived where most would have fallen, illustrating both the fragility and the extraordinary resilience of human life. Her reign was defined by triumph over enemies visible and invisible. The queen who ate danger lived to see her court, her kingdom, and her legacy flourish, a reminder that even amidst decay, power and survival can coexist.